In the Dakota Territory, fall of 1878, riders on the main track would slow their horses as they passed the Miller claim. They weren't looking at the plot of land. They were looking at the girl and what the girl was doing. She was 14 years old. Her name was Elspeth, and they thought she'd lost her mind. She was on the roof of her dugout, a crude shelter dug into a low rise of prairie. But she wasn't laying sod. She wasn't chinking logs. She was meticulously placing huge, paper-thin sheets of birch bark over the roof, overlapping them like pale, papery shingles. To the men who had built their own homes with sweat and heavy timber, it was lunacy. Bark was for canoes, for baskets, for kindling. You didn't build a house with it. They saw a desperate orphan playing with scraps. They saw a fool building a paper shelter against a Dakota winter. And when the winter of '79 hit, a winter of such brutal, relentless cold that it would be spoken of for 100 years, that crazy bark shelter would prove the difference between survival and surrender. If you want to hear the number that made the territory's best builder go silent, stay until the end. What did this 14-year-old girl with nothing but a dull axe and her own 2 hands understand about warmth and shelter that every grown man in the valley had missed? If you're finding us for the first time, subscribe to the channel for more stories of forgotten frontier genius, and drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from tonight. Elspeth Miller wasn't trying to revolutionize anything. She was a 14-year-old orphan, and she was just trying not to freeze to death. Her parents had been taken by cholera 2 years prior. She'd been sent to live with her uncle Thomas, a man with a hard face and 5 children of his own. For a year, she was another shadow in his crowded sod house, earning her keep, quiet and watchful. But the harvest of '78 was thin. The corn was stunted, and an early frost had ruined half the potatoes. One evening in September, Thomas sat her down. His voice was flat, without malice, which somehow made it worse. "Elspeth," he said, "I can't feed a mouth that isn't my own blood through this winter. It ain't right, but it's the truth of it." He wasn't a monster. He was a man trapped by brutal arithmetic. He gave her what he could spare: an old spade with a cracked handle, a worn axe head, a sack with a week's worth of flour and salt pork. He pointed her toward a small, unclaimed plot a mile down the track on the edge of the settlement. "There's a good slope there for a dugout," he told her. "You're a strong girl. You'll manage." And so she did. For 2 weeks she dug. She carved a 10 by 12 foot hole into the side of a low hill, levering out rocks, slicing through the thick turf. She scavenged fallen cottonwood for the ridgepole and the few crude supports. She cut sod bricks from the prairie and laid them over the top. By frontier standards, it was a respectable shelter. It was what everyone did. Then her first winter came, and it delivered its brutal lesson. The problem wasn't the cold, not directly. The problem was the water. When a rare, warm afternoon brought a bit of melt, her sod roof would begin to drip. A slow, steady drip that soaked her blanket, her firewood, her spirit. The earthen walls of the dugout didn't just feel cold. They felt damp. They wept a chilling moisture that clung to everything. Frost would form on the inside of the walls, a sparkling, deadly filigree. She burned a staggering amount of wood, scavenged from creek beds and deadfalls. She fed the small, crude stone fireplace constantly, but the heat seemed to vanish into the damp earth. The cabin never felt truly warm. It just felt less cold. She slept in her coat, curled up as tightly as she could, and often woke shivering in the pre-dawn gloom, her breath a cloud in the air. She survived on snared rabbits and the occasional, silently offered loaf of bread left on her doorstep by one of the settlement's women. That winter carved a core understanding into her. It wasn't just about insulation. It was about moisture. Wet cold was a different animal. Wet cold soaked into your bones and wouldn't let go. Wet wood sputtered and smoked, producing little heat. Wet walls didn't just fail to hold warmth. They actively stole it, sucking the heat from the air, from the fire, from her own body. In the spring, as the world thawed, she spent her days observing, not people. She observed the woods. She watched how water beat it up and ran off the pale, smooth bark of the birch trees. She remembered an old trapper, a friend of her father's, who had once shown her a birch bark canoe, light as a leaf and completely waterproof. He'd said the local tribes called the birch the giving tree. An idea began to form, a simple, radical idea. The sod roof, the standard way, was the problem. It was a sponge. It held the very moisture she was trying to escape. Her neighbors fought the dampness with bigger fires, burning through enormous stacks of cordwood. They were fighting a war of attrition. She didn't have the fuel for that kind of war. She needed a different strategy. Her plan was simple. Her house didn't need a thicker blanket. It needed a raincoat. She waited until late spring, when the sap was running. She went into the woods, far from the common timber stands, with her axe and a small knife. She found fallen birch trees, giants brought down by winter storms. She didn't need to kill a living tree. The forest had already provided. Carefully, she scored the bark and peeled it away in huge, pliable sheets. It was a slow, meticulous process. The bark was thick, almost like leather, but it came away clean. For weeks she gathered it, hauling the sheets back to her dugout and laying them flat with rocks on top so they wouldn't curl as they dried. Her only cost was time and the sweat on her brow. In late summer she began the build. This is where her quiet genius revealed itself. She didn't just slap the bark on top of the old sod roof. She understood instinctively that the secret was not in the material alone, but in the system. First, she laid a crisscrossing lattice of small dead branches over the entire surface of her dugout's roof. This created a gap, a space of about 3 inches between the old sod and the new layer she was about to add. That air gap was the first key. Now, here's what made this actually brilliant. Still air is one of the best insulators on the planet. By creating that gap, she was wrapping her home in a thin, invisible blanket of air. It was like the dead air in a double-pane window. It acted as a thermal break, separating the cold outer layer from the warmer inner structure. Then came the bark. She started at the bottom edge, laying the largest, thickest sheets first, overlapping them by nearly a foot. She worked her way up to the peak of the low roof, laying the bark like giant shingles. Every seam was oriented to shed water down and away. She didn't have nails. She used what she had, wooden pegs driven through the bark into the sod below, and a sticky, waterproof pitch she'd rendered from pine sap over a small fire. She meticulously sealed every single seam, every peg hole, every edge. She didn't stop at the roof. She wrapped the bark sheets down the exposed earthen walls of the dugout, all the way to the ground. She dug a shallow trench around the perimeter and buried the bottom edge of the bark, creating a continuous, waterproof membrane. a building envelope. The narrator has to explain the physics here, conversationally. The sod roof held heat, yes, but it also held water. Its insulating value plummeted when it got wet. The bark, on the other hand, was a shield. Birch bark is saturated with a waxy, waterproof substance called betulin. It doesn't rot. It doesn't absorb water. It sheds it. By separating the two, Elspeth had created a perfect system. The sod roof became the insulation, the thermal mass, and because the air gap allowed it to dry out and stay dry, its insulating properties were maximized. The bark became the weather barrier, the raincoat, deflecting every drop of rain and melt water. She had solved two problems at once: heat loss and moisture penetration. The finished result was bizarre to onlookers. From the track, her home no longer looked like a part of the landscape. It didn't have the green, earthy look of a proper soddy. It looked like a strange, pale drum had been half buried in the prairie. It was smooth, almost seamless, and it gleamed faintly in the autumn sun. It looked flimsy, unnatural. Her Uncle Thomas was the first to comment. He rode past one afternoon, reined in his horse, and just stared for a long moment. He shook his head slowly. "Girl, what foolishness is this?" he called out, his voice thick with disapproval. "A stiff wind will peel that off like a skin from an apple. You'll freeze for your vanity." Elspeth was splitting kindling. She paused, looked at him, and kept her voice level. "We'll see." And when her neighbors saw it, they didn't see engineering. They saw desperation. They saw the strange obsession of a lonely girl. The ridicule started before the first snow. It began not with cruelty, but with expert concern. Silas Blackwood ran the sawmill and had built, by his own count, more than half the cabins and barns in the valley. He was a man whose identity was tied to his knowledge of wood, weather, and shelter. He stopped his wagon one day, ostensibly to ask if she needed lumber. But his eyes were fixed on the pale bark shell. He walked around it, tapping it with his knuckles. "Young lady," he began, his voice a low rumble of authority, "I admire your industry, but you've made a grave error here." He pointed a thick finger at the wall. "I've built 50 structures in this valley. A wall has to breathe. You've sealed this place up like a drum. All the moisture from your cooking, your breathing, it's going to get trapped inside. It won't be able to escape. Your timbers will sweat, and then they'll rot. You're building your own tomb, child. It'll be a damp, moldy grave by Christmas." It was a reasonable objection based on a lifetime of conventional experience. It sounded like wisdom. Elspeth listened politely. She didn't argue. She didn't try to explain the air gap or the properties of bark. She knew it would be useless. "Just trying something different, Mr. Blackwood," was all she said. He shook his head, a look of pity on his face. "Different isn't always better. Sometimes it's just wrong." The public mockery was less considered. At the trading post, where news and gossip were the main currency, her project was a source of amusement. Jebediah Potter, a boy of 16 with loud confidence and cruel humor, saw her slipping in to trade a few rabbit pelts for salt. He called out across the room, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Look, it's the Bark Girl. Bet she talks to squirrels, too." A few men chuckled. Others looked away, embarrassed, but unwilling to defend her. Elspeth kept her eyes down, finished her trade, and left. The name stuck. From then on, the gossip spread. It was whispered over fences and at the church social. Poor thing's lost her wits since her parents passed. Living in a basket, they say. Thomas was right to put her out. She's not right in the head. People would ride out of their way just to pass her claim, pointing and shaking their heads at the strange pale structure. The pressure wasn't just direct. It came secondhand. One of the few women who had been kind to her, Mrs. Gable, stopped leaving bread. Elspeth saw her at the well one day, and the woman couldn't meet her eyes. The community was closing ranks around its shared assumptions, and Elspeth was on the outside. Even the institutions of the frontier registered their skepticism. Mr. Abernathy, the circuit preacher who passed through twice a year, made a special stop. He was a gaunt man with sincere, worried eyes. He saw her shelter as a manifestation of spiritual pride. "Child," he said, his hands clasped, "the Lord appreciates a humble heart. There is wisdom in the proven ways of the community, pride in strange works, in setting yourself apart. It is a path to ruin. I urge you to accept the help of your neighbors and build a proper Christian home." But the cut that went deepest came from family. Her Uncle Thomas made one last visit. He didn't look at the dugout. He looked only at her. His face was a mask of frustration and shame. "Elspeth, people are talking," he said, his voice tight. "They're laughing, not just at you, at me. They're saying I let my own kin build a fool's house. They're saying your foolishness is a stain on my name. People are going to think you're either scared or incompetent, maybe both, and that reflects on me." She finally looked up from her work, her gaze steady. "I'm not trying to impress anyone, Thomas," she said. "I'm not trying to make you look any way at all. I'm trying to stay warm." He threw his hands up in disgust and rode away without another word. By the first hard frost of October, the consensus was absolute. Not one person in the valley thought Elspeth Miller had solved a problem. They thought she'd built a monument to her own strangeness. She was no longer just an orphan. She was the valley's resident fool. Stay with me, because what happened next didn't just prove a 14-year-old girl right. It changed how an entire community thought about survival itself. Then November came, and it brought the kind of cold that separates theory from reality. The winter of 1879 is still recorded in the climatology archives. They called it the Great Freeze. It wasn't just a storm. It was a season-long siege. It started with a week of temperatures that never rose above zero. That was just the prelude. By December 8th, the thermometer at the trading post read minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit overnight. December 12th, minus 31 degrees Fahrenheit. On the morning of December 18th, the mercury was frozen in the bulb, but a spirit thermometer registered minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit, with a relentless northwest wind that drove the wind chill below minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Snow didn't fall so much as it was driven horizontally, piling into massive sculpted drifts that buried fences and blocked roads. For 31 consecutive days, the thermometer never once climbed above the zero mark. The cold was an occupying army. It broke things. It broke tools, it broke wagons, and it broke spirits. The community began to suffer, not in silence, but in a series of small, cascading failures. The Blackwood family, in their fine, two-story timber house, were burning through a cord of seasoned oak every single week, and still the downstairs rooms hovered at a miserable 45 degrees. Their children lived in coats and blankets. Jebediah Potter's family, who had laughed the loudest, lost 3 of their best milk cows. The animals had frozen to death, standing in their own stalls in a barn that was considered well built. Uncle Thomas's cabin was a nightmare. His sod roof, saturated from autumn rains, had frozen into a solid block of ice. It radiated cold. They were burning green, unseasoned wood because their seasoned pile was gone. The cabin was constantly filled with a choking, eye-watering smoke. His youngest daughter developed a deep, rattling cough that wouldn't go away. They were burning fence posts by the second week of December. Across the valley, the story was the same. Desperate families were burning through a half-cord of wood a week just to stay alive, just to keep their indoor temperatures above freezing. Chimneys, caked with creosote from smoky, inefficient fires, caught flame. Livestock starved or froze. The daily work of survival, hauling water, tending animals, chopping wood, became a brutal, dangerous ordeal. And then people started noticing the girl's place. There were no signs of distress. Riders fighting their way along the snow-choked track would see a thin, steady, almost lazy wisp of smoke rising from her small stone chimney. It wasn't the thick, panicked plume of a desperate fire being fed constantly. It was the smoke of a fire that was merely being maintained. One afternoon, Silas Blackwood was making an emergency delivery of firewood to a family down the track. As he passed Elspeth's dugout, he saw her outside. She was splitting a few small logs for kindling. It was minus 25 degrees Fahrenheit. He was wrapped in 3 layers of wool and a heavy buffalo coat. She was wearing her simple cloth coat and a shawl. No hat, no gloves. She worked with a steady, unhurried rhythm. She didn't look like she was freezing. She looked like she was doing a chore. The image lodged in his mind. It didn't make sense. It contradicted everything he knew. The flimsiest house in the valley seemed to be weathering the worst winter in memory with impossible ease. Stay with me, because the number that came out of this cabin didn't just surprise the valley. It defied the laws of winter as they understood them. It was December 24th, Christmas Eve. The temperature outside was minus 41 degrees Fahrenheit, a deep, soul-crushing cold that found every crack and every seam. Silas Blackwood sat in his own house, closer to the stove than was comfortable, and still felt a chill on his back. He thought of the people he'd delivered wood to. He thought of their shivering children, their tired, worried faces. And he thought of the girl in the barkhouse. A profound sense of guilt settled over him. He, the master builder, the man everyone looked to, had mocked her. He'd predicted her home would be a rotten tomb by now. If she was in trouble, if she was freezing, it was partly on his conscience. He had offered scorn instead of help. He couldn't stand it. He pulled on his coat, went to his woodpile, and loaded a half-dozen big logs of seasoned oak onto a sled. It was a penance. He set off through the deep snow, the runners of the sled groaning in protest. He expected to find a house of ice. He feared he might have to break the door down and find the girl frozen in her bed. He reached the dugout and knocked on the small, solid wooden door. For a moment, there was no answer. His heart sank. He knocked again, harder. "Elspeth, it's Silas Blackwood." The door opened. The first thing that happened was the warmth. It rolled out of the small opening and hit him like a physical thing. It wasn't the scorching, dry heat of an overstoked fire. It was a steady, even, gentle warmth. He could feel it on the exposed skin of his face, a shocking contrast to the brutal air. The second thing he saw was the girl. Elspeth stood in the doorway. She was wearing a simple, mended wool dress and an apron. Not a coat, not a shawl, not a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. Her feet were in wool socks, not heavy boots. She looked comfortable. She looked calm. He was so stunned he forgot why he had come. He just stared. "Everything all right, Mr. Blackwood?" she asked, her voice quiet. He finally found his tongue. I brought some wood," he stammered, gesturing to the sled. "I was worried. Figured you might be low." She looked at the logs, then back at him. A small, unreadable expression crossed her face. "That's kind of you, sir, but I'm managing just fine." His gaze went past her, into the small, clean interior of the dugout. He saw her small woodpile next to the stone hearth. It was neat, but it was modest. It wasn't the huge, chaotic stack of a household fighting a losing battle with the cold. "How much are you burning?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The question was absurd, but he had to know. "A small armload in the morning after I get up," she said simply, "and one in the evening before I sleep. The fire holds well." Silas Blackwood did the math in his head, and the result was so staggering it felt like a lie. An armload in the morning, an armload at night. She was burning, perhaps, a third of a cord a month, maybe less. He was burning 4 cords a month in a house he had built himself. The Potters were burning 5, and they were still cold. The difference wasn't incremental. It was categorical. He didn't have a thermometer. He didn't need one. The evidence was standing right in front of him, in a simple wool dress. The evidence was in the air he was breathing. He had to see. May I come in for a moment?" "Of course," she said, stepping aside. He stepped across the threshold, and it was like entering a different season. The air was warm, yes, but more than that, it was dry. There was no hint of dampness, no smell of mildew or rot. He ran his bare hand along the interior earthen wall. It wasn't slick with condensation. It wasn't even cold to the touch. It was cool, but it was bone dry. He looked up at the ceiling timbers, the very timbers he had predicted would be rotten by now. They were clean and pale. No black spots of mold, no telltale sheen of moisture. His professional diagnosis had been completely, utterly wrong. He, the expert, had seen a sealed wall and predicted rot. He had failed to see the ventilated air gap and the perfect waterproof membrane that made the entire system work. She hadn't built a tomb. She'd built a thermos. He stood there in the middle of the small room, a giant in his heavy coat, turning in a slow circle. He saw a small table with a book on it, a clean swept floor, a bed with a single quilt. It wasn't just a shelter, it was a home. It was a space of impossible comfort and dignity in the heart of a brutal winter. He turned back to Elspeth. He looked at this 14-year-old girl who had been cast out, mocked, and dismissed. This child had done what he and every other builder in the territory had failed to do. She hadn't just built a warmer house. She had built a smarter one. The words came out, heavy as stones. "I was wrong," he paused, the admission hanging in the warm, still air. Then he said the words that mattered even more. He looked around the room one last time, at the dry walls and the clean timbers. "We've all been wrong." He turned and left without another word, leaving the oak logs on the sled outside. They weren't a gift of charity anymore. They were an apology. Elspeth opened the door, warm and healthy, his heart heavy with dread. He too knocked, expecting the worst. When Elspeth opened the door, warm and healthy, he was speechless. Unlike Blackwood, he was a man of instruments. He carried a small pocket thermometer. He asked if he could hang it on her wall. She obliged. They waited in silence for 10 minutes. When he retrieved it, he held it to the light of her small lamp. The mercury sat clearly at 61 degrees Fahrenheit. Let that sink in for a moment. 61 degrees. While outside, the wind howled and the temperature was minus 38. A temperature differential of 99 degrees. Abernathy had families on his prayer list who were celebrating if their cabins hit 40. He meticulously recorded the date, the time, the external and internal temperatures in his journal. He underlined the number, 61 degrees Fahrenheit. It wasn't just data. It was a miracle. The vindication wasn't just about being warm. It was about a fundamental shift. The system Elspeth had designed turned winter from something to be survived into something to be lived through. She could read, mend her clothes, and cook her meals without shivering. She could sleep through the night without waking to feed a ravenous fire. Her tiny dugout, once a symbol of her foolishness, had become the warmest, safest, and most efficient home in the entire valley. Word spreads fast in a small community, especially when that word comes from a man like Silas Blackwood. He didn't hide his error. He proclaimed it. He stood on the porch of the trading post and told anyone who would listen. The girl was right, he said, his voice silencing the usual chatter. Her place is dry as a bone and warmer than my own kitchen. She figured something out. We were all fools for laughing. Coming from him, the statement was irrefutable. The mockery died overnight, replaced by a stunned, grudging respect. But respect doesn't keep children warm. Desperation does. The first to convert was Mary O'Malley. Her family lived in a leaky soddy down by the creek, and their newborn son had been sick for a month with a persistent cough. The damp cold of their home was killing him, slowly. One morning, after a night spent listening to her baby wheeze, she bundled up and walked the mile to Elspeth's dugout. She didn't arrive with pride. She came with a mother's desperate plea. "Please," she said, tears freezing on her cheeks, "show me what you did." Elspeth didn't gloat. She saw the fear in the woman's eyes and simply nodded. She invited her in, gave her a cup of warm tea, and explained. It wasn't a secret. Most important part. The roof has to most important part. The roof has to breathe between the layers. That spring, Silas Blackwood, without being asked, delivered a load of scrap lumber to the O'Malley claim, enough to build a proper frame for their own bark shell. He showed Mary's husband how to build it. By the following autumn, their dugout was wrapped in the same pale waterproof skin as Elspeth's. Their second winter was a revelation. Their son's cough vanished. They burned less than half the wood they had the year before. They lived in a comfort they had never imagined possible. The O'Malley success was the spark. That next summer, 3 more families barked their homes. By the fall of 1881, there were 12 bark-wrapped dugouts in the valley. They were easy to spot. They were the ones with the thin wisps of smoke coming from their chimneys, the homes where children played on the floor without shivering. The Dakota Rap, as some started calling it, became a symbol not of strangeness, but of smart survival. The story spread beyond the valley. Mr. Abernathy, the preacher, was a man of letters. He wrote a detailed account of what he'd witnessed in his yearly report to the Missionary Society back east. He called it a novel and providential method for insulating prairie dwellings. A small farming journal picked up the story, and soon inquiries were coming from settlers as far away as Nebraska and Kansas. What Elspeth Miller had built through pure observation and necessity anticipated by nearly a century what modern building scientists would rediscover and call a ventilated rain screen. She had created a high-performance building envelope using nothing but natural materials, basic tools, and a profound understanding of how heat, air, and moisture actually worked. Years later, as an old woman, people would still ask her about it. They wanted to hear about her stroke of genius, her moment of invention. She would always wave the idea away. "It wasn't new," she'd say, her voice still quiet but steady. "The trees showed me. Sod holds water. Bark sheds it. The rest is just common sense." A photograph taken in the 1930s by a government surveyor shows the old Miller claim. The dugout has long since collapsed, the earth slumping back into the hole she dug as a girl. But you can still see it, half buried in the grass, a large, surprisingly intact section of the birch bark shell, still pale, still waiting to shed a rain that would never come. The frontier was a brutal teacher. It didn't reward stubbornness, and it didn't reward tradition for tradition's sake. It rewarded what worked. The people who survived and thrived were the ones who were willing to stop, to observe, and to question the assumptions everyone else took for granted. They were the ones who understood that the best answers weren't always found in a book or in the words of an expert, but sometimes they were written right on the skin of a tree, waiting for someone quiet enough to read them. Drop a comment and let us know, where are you watching from? And what's the coldest winter you've ever had to face? Subscribe for one proven frontier technique every week, and like this video if it changed how you think about shelter. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions of frontier survival techniques. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, created for narrative purposes. However, the engineering and building science principles are based on real historical practices and the documented properties of natural materials.